Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We've now reached the episode that has attracted the attention of scholars and history buffs more than any other in American history, the Civil War. In the previous lectures, we talked about causes of the Civil War, one of the most compelling questions in American history. In this next series of lectures, we'll talk about the war itself. And though, while I won't get into a battle-by-battle and troop-movement-by-troop-movement breakdown that would satisfy the biggest military buffs in the group, we will talk about the social and cultural impact of the war and its vast and lasting impact on the state of the country itself. In this first lecture, we're going to take a look at both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, looking at some of the advantages and disadvantages of each side heading into the war. If we were to break down the advantages of each side, much like the tail of the tape in a boxing match or anticipating a major sporting event, it would hard to go into the Civil War thinking anything other than that the North possessed huge advantages and would in all likelihood be favored to win that war. In terms of population, the population in the North was about 2.5 times the population of the South, including about 3 times the number of draftable men, in other words, men who could fight in the war. So ultimately, about 2.5 million men would fight for the North, compared to about 800,000 for the South. Probably more important than just the number of men was the backing to support those men in terms of industry and weapons and supplies produced. The industrial capacity of the North was about 90% more than that of the South. There were about 1.3 million industrial workers in the North compared to only about 110,000 industrial workers in the South. And that meant output in really every significant category that was far larger in the North than the South. Most notably, the North produced about 97% of the weapons on the eve of the Civil War, the South only 3%. And the North produced about 94% of its cloth and 90% of its shoes and boots and things of that nature. Now, we'll talk about the South momentarily, but it's important to note that much of that cloth was derived from Southern cotton, which obviously was a huge advantage for the South. The North also possessed about 11 times the number of ships of the South on the eve of the Civil War, and its railroad structure was far more extensive, far more uniform. About 22,000 miles of railroad track in the North compared to about 9,000 in the South. And the North possessed an advantage in terms of food and rations of about 2 to 1. So again, if we're just looking kind of at numbers on a page, the North seemed to possess huge and perhaps even insurmountable advantages. It's fair to say that as the war was getting started, they had a much larger and much better equipped military force, which was able to move around more quickly and readily than that of the Confederacy. Now, as we'll see in just a moment when we talk about Southern advantages, some of these Northern advantages didn't necessarily play out to success on the battlefield, especially early on in the Civil War. As the war began, the South had its share of advantages as well. So first of all, we have to note that the South would be fighting a defensive war. That is, it was upon the North to invade and conquer and hold the territory that they were taking from the South. This is an incredibly difficult thing to do. If we think about a more recent war like the Vietnam War, the invading force has to take over and hold territory in another nation's homeland. And it's just a very difficult thing to do that. It also means that those in the South were defending their own homes and their own way of life, which can lead to a much stronger sort of motivation in the war. There were times in the war when Northerners began to lose their sense of motivation, whereas Southerners were defending their home, their homeland, their way of life throughout the entire war. And there may also have been just some sort of home field advantage if we carry on the sports metaphor. Um, Southern generals and soldiers knew the land, knew the territory, and there were definitely moments in the Civil War when it seemed that Southerners had a more intuitive sense of the best places to fight a battle, for instance. On a similar note, we have to keep in mind that the South was a huge territory, some 750,000 square miles of territory that, again, the North would have to conquer and hold and control. So, in some ways, the South didn't have to win this war. They only had not to lose. They could basically fight to a stalemate or a tie and still effectively win. There were also, of course, many obstacles involved for an invading force trying to take over that territory. Many rivers, and if any of you have traveled around the South, even in the upstate of South Carolina or parts of North Carolina, there are mountains, there are hills, there are rivers, and fast-moving whitewater rivers. Imagine trying to move an army through that terrain. And as we've mentioned, the infrastructure in the South was not as good as that in the North. So things like roads and railroads, where they existed at all, were not as good as that in the North. And so while we talked about the Northern railroads and infrastructure as an advantage, once the Union Army enters the South, they are having to contend with some of the disadvantages of the infrastructure in the South, roads and bridges and railroads and things that were not as thorough and not as well put together. And we've also in previous lectures talked about what I described as a culture of violence in the South. Remember, we talked about no holds barred kind of backwoods fighting. It's hard to cast too broad of a net over this. And soldier by soldier, man by man, there were certainly some very tough, good Union soldiers in the same way that there were some tough, good Southern soldiers. But I think it's fair to say, and scholars have written extensively about how this culture of violence meant that Southern soldiers, especially at the beginning of the war, were simply more used to fighting, putting themselves at risk, violent, hitting someone, attacking someone. And actually, that carried out on the battlefield, particularly in a number of the early battles in the war. And if we think about morale and confidence, Southern soldiers early in the war were extremely confident in their fighting abilities. And there was a sort of intimidation. Southern soldiers would unleash what we call the rebel yell, just this horrible cry and cheer as they stormed onto the battlefield. And Northern soldiers were literally intimidated by that, and in some cases sort of hesitated or even retreated in the face of this charge. Now, that didn't necessarily persist through the entire war. The Union Army got better and sort of stronger as the war went on, and the Southern Army lost some of that advantage. But as the war began, it's fair to say that Southern soldiers were more accustomed to violence and probably had a greater sense of confidence on the battlefield. As a final note, and this again was not always clear at the outset of the war, but became clear over the first year or two, the Confederacy clearly was possessed of stronger generalship and leadership. The major Southern general, Robert E. Lee, was crafty and inspirational and again intuitive. And his second in command, Stonewall Jackson, equally crafty and stymied superior Northern armies time and again early in the war. In contrast, George McClellan, the Northern general through the first couple of years of the war, was a great organizer and did some good things kind of behind the lines. But he was slow to commit in battle. And in a war that the North had to be the conqueror to win, McClellan seemed incapable of launching major offensives. We're going to be talking about some of those kind of tactical and strategic elements of the war in future lectures. But for now, this gives you a breakdown of what the two sides looked like at the outset of the war.